Hi, Sam. Thank you for joining me today to answer a few questions.
My pleasure to be here.
Okay, awesome. Let's get into the questions.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, so what first got you interested in global trade and supply chain?
Well, actually started off when I was quite young. My dad was working for this company called Clearly Canadian. It's the beverage and the clear bottle that some people might be familiar with. He used to do, he was the chief operating officer there, so he was responsible for all the logistics and moving the bottles around and moving the different formulas that go into the drink. And I thought, oh, that's kind of interesting. I saw what he did. And throughout my teenage years, I got more and more interested in transport and logistics. And I went, after high school, I went to BCIT, which is here in Vancouver, and I did my undergrad degree in operations and logistics management. And I really just, even since BCIT, I just become more and more interested in the topic.
Awesome. Wow. Yeah. Long history there. So for students unfamiliar with tariffs, how do they impact everyday costs, especially with rising costs recently?
Well, I think the thing with tariffs that you have to remember is it's the importer that pays the tariff. So when Donald Trump says, oh, we have 145% tariff on China, it's actually the US companies that are importing into the United States that are paying that tariff. So what ends up happening is those US companies, of course, they're not going to absorb 145% in terms of cost. They're going to pass it on to you and me in terms of our daily things. If we go into a Walmart, or if we go to buy school supplies, or if we go to try and get a new vehicle, all of those costs are going to be increasing. And especially as Canadians, because we live so close to the US and we're so reliant on their economy, basically that means that whenever prices rise in the US, we tend to see prices increase here in Canada as well, not to mention all the tariffs that Trump has put on Canadians over the past 2 or 3 months.
You've said that tariffs affect what's on store shelves. So can you share an example of this in the real world?
Yeah, we're actually seeing that happening at the moment. So with the tariffs that Trump has put in on China, there's been a lot of container ships coming into the west coast of the United States from China that are either empty, or we're seeing a huge drop in container traffic coming into Los Angeles and into Long Beach and into Seattle. And what that basically means is that all of these American companies that would have been ordering from China have canceled their orders, or they are just moving it to different countries. So what ends up happening is that we're more than likely in May and into June of this year, we're going to see shortages on store shelves, such as in Target, as in Walmart. Anybody who is selling baby supplies or toys or electronics or appliances, there are going to be either reduced variety on store shelves, or we're going to see that there's going to be empty store shelves on some of the big retail stores.
Oh no, that's not good.
No.
Do you think Canada is doing enough to protect its businesses from international trade shocks?
I don't. I think Canada has gone through a big change recently, obviously with Mark Carney being elected to his role. He has been very forceful in trying to advocate for the sovereignty of Canada, and all of that has been very, very good. And he does have a lot of sort of plans for protecting Canadian businesses. However, I think in general, the Canadian economy is far too reliant on the US for imports and exports. 70% of our exports go to the States, 55% of our imports come from the States. And what I really think the Carney government needs to be doing is prioritizing diversification. And by that, I mean that we need to have policymakers and politicians sitting down with businesses and really looking at other places to trade with, in particular China, India, and the Asian nations, so places like Indonesia, Vietnam, etc. And I'm not seeing enough of that coming from the Canadian government, really prioritizing diversification.
If you weren't teaching or doing research, what do you think you'd be doing instead?
Well, I've done a lot of stuff outside of academia. I actually used to work in business for 15 odd years in supply chain roles. My last job was with Adidas, the clothing and apparel company. So I used to, when I was living in England, I worked for them doing things like bringing in their containers from China and trying to plan where the different shipments go, and then move things around the world on behalf of Adidas. So had I not made the decision during my time there, I'd probably still be working for Adidas or Adidas, or I would be doing some sort of operations and supply chain management role, maybe for a consulting company like a KPMG or something like that.
What's one book, movie, or podcast that you always recommend to students?
I think there's a lot of interesting podcasts out. I think a couple of the things that I always follow is the Wall Street Journal does some really good things on supply chains and shipments. There's also a really nice podcast called About That, which is done by the CBC. And the guy on there tries to kind of digest all of this stuff to do with tariffs and trade. And he takes something that can be quite complicated and really breaks it down into easier sort of digestible bits. So in my classes, when I'm teaching a second year undergrad operations management course, what I'll tend to do is I'll play videos for my students. I'll show them a Wall Street Journal video about how Apple makes their iPhones and how they manufacture them in China, Vietnam, and how they ship them into Canada and the US, just to kind of give them a picture of how it all fits together. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for answering these questions. I actually learned a lot.
Great, glad to hear it.